When the temperature hit minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit and the Johnson family's car broke down on a deserted Colorado highway, they had maybe 3 hours before hypothermia would claim their lives. That's when retired Army Ranger Daniel Cooper pulled over and transformed a death sentence into a survival story that would amaze rescue teams the next morning. The blizzard had been building all afternoon, turning what should have been a beautiful December drive through the Colorado Rockies into something that looked more like the surface of an alien planet. Snow fell in thick, driving sheets that made it nearly impossible to see more than 20 feet ahead, and the wind howled across Highway 285 with a ferocity that made even experienced mountain drivers nervous. Mark Johnson gripped the steering wheel of his Honda Pilot with white knuckles, fighting to keep the vehicle centered on a road he could barely see. In the passenger seat, his wife Sarah clutched her phone, searching desperately for cell signal that had disappeared somewhere near the last town. In the back seat, 8-year-old Emma pressed her face against the window, watching the snow swirl in patterns that would have been beautiful under different circumstances, while 5-year-old Jake slept peacefully in his car seat, oblivious to the growing tension in the vehicle. They were supposed to be home by now. The drive from Sarah's parents' house in Alamosa to their home in Colorado Springs usually took about 2.5 hours, but they'd been on the road for 4 hours already and were still at least an hour away. Assuming they could maintain their current crawling pace, and assuming the road didn't become completely impassable. "Maybe we should stop," Sarah said, her voice tight with worry. "Find a hotel or something. Wait for this to pass." Mark nodded, but they both knew their options were limited. They'd passed the last town 20 miles ago, and the next one was still 30 miles ahead. The GPS on his phone had lost signal along with everything else, and the radio was picking up nothing but static and emergency weather warnings that told them what they already knew. This was the worst blizzard to hit the region in over a decade. That's when the engine started making the noise. It began as a subtle knock, barely audible over the wind and the sound of snow hitting the windshield. But within minutes, it had grown into a grinding, metallic scream that made Mark's stomach drop and caused Sarah to look at him with an expression of dawning horror. "Mark," she said quietly, try not to wake Jake or alarm Emma. "What does that sound?" Before he could answer, the engine shuddered, coughed, and died completely. The Honda coasted to a stop on the side of the highway, hazard lights automatically blinking in the growing darkness as Mark turned the key frantically, hoping for some sign of life from under the hood. Nothing. "Daddy," Emma asked from the back seat, her voice small and uncertain. "Why did we stop?" "It's okay, sweetheart," Mark said, his voice steadier than he felt. "The car just needs to rest for a minute." But it wasn't okay, and all four of them knew it. They were stranded on a mountain highway in sub-zero temperatures with visibility near zero and no way to call for help. The Honda's heater had died with the engine, and Mark could already feel the cold beginning to seep through the windows. He tried the engine again and again. Each attempt produced nothing but clicking sounds that seemed to mock their predicament. "How long before someone comes?" Sarah asked, her breath already beginning to fog in the rapidly cooling car. Mark didn't answer because he didn't have a good answer. Highway 285 was never heavily traveled, especially not during a blizzard like this. The Colorado Department of Transportation would eventually send plows, but that could be hours away. Maybe longer if the storm got worse. Meanwhile, the temperature inside the car was dropping steadily. Mark's phone showed the outside temperature as minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit and falling. Even with the car providing some shelter from the wind, hypothermia would become a real danger within a few hours, especially for the children. Sarah wrapped Jake in his blanket and pulled Emma close to her, trying to share body heat. Mark rummaged through their emergency kit, a basic collection of jumper cables, flares, and blankets that had seemed adequate for normal emergencies but felt woefully insufficient for their current situation. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Jake woke up and immediately started crying from a cold, despite being bundled in every spare piece of clothing they could find. Emma tried to be brave, but Mark could see her shivering despite the layers Sarah had wrapped around her. "Daddy," Emma said through chattering teeth, "I'm really cold." "I know, baby. We're going to figure this out." But Mark was beginning to panic. He'd tried flagging down the few vehicles that had passed, but visibility was so poor that most drivers probably couldn't see them until they were already past. His phone showed no signal, and even if he could get through to 911, how would rescue teams find them in this weather? The windows were starting to fog over, and Mark realized with growing horror that they were facing a genuine survival situation. He'd read stories about people freezing to death in their cars during winter storms, but he'd never imagined it could happen to his family. That's when he saw the headlights. At first, they were just a faint glow in the swirling snow, moving slowly along the highway. Mark scrambled out of the car, immediately hit by wind that felt like frozen knives, and began waving his arms frantically. The cold was so intense that his breath formed ice crystals in the air, and he could feel his exposed skin beginning to burn from the wind chill. "Please see us," he thought desperately. "Please don't drive past." The headlights slowed, then stopped. A dark pickup truck pulled over behind their Honda, hazard lights joining the rhythm of their own flashing distress signal. The truck's door opened, and a figure emerged, a man in his mid-50s wearing heavy winter gear that looked both practical and well-used. He moved with the deliberate, efficient gait of someone who had dealt with harsh conditions before, and when he approached Mark, his voice was calm and reassuring. "You folks having car trouble?" "The engine died," Mark said, his teeth already chattering. "We've got 2 small kids in there, and we can't get any cell signal." The man nodded, assessing the situation with eyes that seemed to take in everything at once: the disabled vehicle, the weather conditions, the obvious distress of the family. When he spoke again, his voice carried an authority that immediately made Mark feel like help had arrived. "My name's Daniel Cooper. I'm going to help you get through this, but I need you to trust me and follow my instructions exactly." "Can you do that?" "Yes," Mark said without hesitation. Something about Daniel's presence, calm, competent, unflappable, made him believe that rescue was possible. "Good. First thing, we're not going anywhere tonight. The roads are impassable, and even if we could move your car, we'd be risking getting stuck somewhere worse. So we're going to hunker down right here and wait for the plows to come through in the morning." Mark felt his heart sink. "But the cold, the kids are going to be fine," Daniel said firmly. "But we need to work fast and work smart." Daniel moved quickly to his truck and began pulling out equipment that looked like it came from a different world than Mark's basic emergency kit. Military-grade sleeping bags, thermal blankets, a portable camping stove, chemical heat packs, emergency food rations, and other gear that suggested this was someone who understood survival in extreme conditions. "You military?" Mark asked as Daniel efficiently organized the supplies. "Was. Army Rangers. Retired 5 years ago." Daniel's voice was matter-of-fact, as if being prepared for situations like this was the most natural thing in the world. Within minutes, Daniel had transformed their desperate situation into something that looked manageable. He'd moved the Johnson family into his truck, which had a larger cab and better insulation than their Honda. The children were bundled in sleeping bags designed for Arctic conditions, and Sarah was holding chemical heat packs that provided immediate warmth. But Daniel wasn't finished. While the family warmed up, he set up what he called a winter bivouac, using their disabled car as a windbreak and creating an insulated shelter with tarps and reflective blankets. The portable stove provided not just heat, but also hot water for drinks and food. "Mr. Cooper," Sarah said, her voice filled with amazement and gratitude, "how did you know to carry all this stuff?" Daniel smiled as he handed him a cup of hot chocolate from the camping stove. 25 years in the Army teaches you to be ready for anything. Mountain warfare training, cold weather operations, survival courses. After a while, it becomes second nature to pack for the worst-case scenario. Jake had stopped crying and was now fascinated by the tiny stove and the way Daniel seemed to produce exactly what they needed from his seemingly endless supply of equipment. "Are you a superhero?" Jake asked solemnly, clutching his cup of hot chocolate. Daniel laughed, the first time Mark had heard him show anything but serious competence. "No, Budhi, just someone who learned how to be prepared." As the night wore on, Daniel proved to be not just a skilled survival expert, but an excellent companion for a long, cold wait. He told stories that kept the children entertained, checked on everyone's warmth and comfort regularly, and maintained a radio that occasionally picked up weather updates and emergency communications. The storm's supposed to break around dawn, he reported after listening to a staticky weather broadcast. Plows should be through here by mid-morning. Mark found himself watching Daniel with something approaching awe. The man moved with the efficiency of someone who had faced far worse situations and emerged victorious. Every action was purposeful, every decision was confident, and every interaction with his family was kind and reassuring. "How many times have you done something like this?" Mark asked during one of the quiet moments when the children were dozing. Daniel considered the question. "In the Army? Dozens of times. Cold weather survival, mountain rescue operations, emergency extractions in hostile territory. But honestly, this is the first time I've done it on a Colorado highway." "You saved our lives," Sarah said quietly. "We had no idea what we were doing out there." "You were doing fine," Daniel replied. "You stayed with your vehicle, you had some supplies, you kept the kids calm. That's exactly what you're supposed to do. I just had a little more gear and experience to build on what you'd already done right." But Mark knew that wasn't entirely true. Without Daniel's intervention, they would have spent the night in a freezing car with inadequate supplies and no real plan for staying warm. The outcome could have been tragic. Around 3 a.m., the wind began to die down slightly, and the snow changed from the driving, blinding sheets they'd endured all evening to a steadier but less aggressive fall. Daniel monitored the conditions constantly, checking the temperature, watching for any signs that the weather was improving enough for travel. "Still too dangerous to move," he reported. "But we're past the worst of it. Another few hours, and we should start seeing some traffic." Emma had fallen asleep curled up against Sarah, and Jake was unconscious in his car seat, both children warm and safe in a situation that could have killed them. Mark felt a gratitude so profound it was almost overwhelming. "Daniel," he said quietly, "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me," Daniel replied. "This is what people do for each other." Not everyone would have stopped. Not everyone would have known what to do. Daniel was quiet for a moment, staring out at the snow-covered highway. "In the Rangers, we had a saying, 'Rangers lead the way.' It meant that when other people couldn't or wouldn't do something, Rangers stepped up. After you retire, you don't stop being a Ranger. You just find different ways to lead the way." At 6:47 a.m., they heard the rumble of heavy machinery in the distance. Daniel listened carefully, then smiled. "That's a snowplow," he announced. "Cavalry's coming." Within an hour, a Colorado Department of Transportation crew had reached them, followed by a tow truck that Daniel had somehow managed to contact using his radio. The highway was being cleared, and the Johnson family's ordeal was coming to an end. As the tow truck driver worked to get their Honda ready for transport, the lead plow operator approached Daniel. "You the guy who's been keeping this family safe all night?" the operator asked. Daniel nodded. "Hell of a thing," the operator said, shaking his head. Temperature hit minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit around midnight. Without shelter and heat, they wouldn't have made it. Mark felt his blood run cold. 22 degrees below zero. He'd had no idea how close they'd come to disaster. As they prepared to leave, the family riding with Daniel while their car was towed to the nearest town, Sarah turned to their rescuer with tears in her eyes. "Daniel, how can we ever repay you?" "You can't," Daniel said simply. "And you don't need to. But if you want to do something, pay it forward. Help someone else when they need it. That's how it works." 2 weeks later, Mark Johnson wrote a letter to the local newspaper describing their experience and Daniel's heroism. The story was picked up by regional media, then national news outlets. Daniel found himself somewhat reluctantly thrust into the spotlight as an example of everyday heroism. When reporters called him for interviews, his responses were always the same. "I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who was in the right place with the right training." Anyone would have done the same thing. But the emergency responders who dealt with winter rescues knew better. The Colorado State Patrol issued a statement noting that without Daniel's intervention, the Johnson family incident would almost certainly have become a fatality case. The survival shelter he'd constructed and the supplies he'd provided had quite literally been the difference between life and death. A month after the rescue, Mark and Sarah Johnson drove back to the spot on Highway 285 where their car had broken down. They brought flowers and a small plaque that read, in gratitude for the kindness of strangers and the courage of those who serve. They also brought something else, a complete winter emergency kit like the one Daniel had used to save them. Because they'd taken his advice about paying it forward seriously, and they wanted to be ready to help someone else if the opportunity arose. 3 years later, Mark Johnson would use that kit to help a stranded motorist during another Colorado blizzard. He didn't have Daniel's military training or extensive experience, but he had supplies, he had knowledge gained from his own rescue, and most importantly, he had the understanding that sometimes being in the right place with the right attitude is enough to save a life. Because that's what Daniel Cooper had taught him during one long, cold night on a mountain highway. Heroism isn't about being invincible or fearless. It's about being prepared, staying calm, and refusing to leave people behind when they need help most. And sometimes, that's enough to turn a potential tragedy into a story of survival, kindness, and the extraordinary things that ordinary people can do when they decide that helping others isn't just an option, it's an obligation. Daniel Cooper never thought of himself as a hero. He was just a retired soldier who kept emergency supplies in his truck and believed that Rangers lead the way, whether they're wearing uniforms or not. But to the Johnson family, and to everyone who heard their story, he was exactly the kind of hero the world needs more of. The kind who shows up when things look impossible and quietly, competently, does whatever it takes to make sure everyone gets home safe. Because that's what real heroes do. They don't seek recognition or reward. They just see someone in trouble and ask themselves a simple question: what can I do to help? And then they do it,